Oh boy, the Haunted Mansion. Wait, what? I have a bad feeling about this.
Welcome, foolish mortals, to the Haunted Mansion.
You got termites or something? Big house like this must have a lot of termites.
We find it delightfully unlivable here in this ghostly retreat.
Yeah, sure, I believe in ghosts.
Shh, you're ruining it.
Every room has wall-to-wall creeps.
We should talk about how many bathrooms are in the house.
Oh, for
People
crying
love
out
bathrooms.
loud.
We should play up the whole...
Call in the spirits, wherever they're at.
Spirits? Ain't no dark spirits. Don't you make no dark spirits come out.
Ugh, this is the worst version of the Haunted Mansion ever. However, speaking of alternate versions of the Haunted Mansion, how about we explore the original spooky attraction that could have been, how and why it never became a reality, and what traces exist today. The story begins in 1951 with Mickey Mouse Park, Walt Disney's initial vision for what would eventually evolve into Disneyland, as even back then it was to feature a haunted house overlooking a cemetery and a church. Of course, the park would see drastic revisions over the next few years, but a haunted house was still part of the plans as late as 1953, this one set to be located at the end of Main Street, USA. However, as the park continued to evolve, this version of the haunted house was put on hold, and its future would depend entirely on the success of Disneyland.
And little did anyone think then that Mickey would be the mouse to be credited with building the biggest people trap in the world, Disneyland.
Fast forward to early 1957, as once it was obvious the park was a huge success, Walt Disney assigned artist and Imagineer Ken Anderson to revive the haunted house. The attraction began as a walkthrough experience, however this time it would not be located on Main Street, instead it would be next door to a pirate wax museum as part of the New Orleans expansion. It was even featured in the park's first souvenir map, simply listed as Haunted House, and we have a pretty detailed description of what was initially planned. Visitors would approach the mansion and find themselves in a courtyard, where they'd spot the appearance of a woman in one of the windows who is pulled back into the darkness by a hairy-armed man. The attraction officially began in the portrait room, where you learned a bit about the house's backstory, as on display was the house's owner Bartholomew Gore and his wife Priscilla. You exit through a secret passageway and see Priscilla spying on her husband as he looks over a treasure map. It turns out he's actually the notorious and bloodthirsty pirate Black Bart Roberts, also known as Captain Gore. You then see Priscilla opening a chest he told her never to touch, and she learns even more about his dark past. He catches her in the act, and after an altercation, winds up killing his beloved wife. Next was the attraction's highlight, involving a pirate ship and a bayou. Now there's some mention of a voodoo plot being integrated into the story, and this scene might have showcased this, but details are sketchy. Visitors then witness the paranoia of Captain Gore as he's haunted by his wife and those he killed in the past. In concept art you see him in his bed, surrounded by past victims and the ghostly footprints of his beloved ex-wife as he tries to shoot her. Visitors were then haunted by the spirit of Priscilla themselves in a rather spooky scene. Ultimately, he winds up hanging himself, unable to cope with the guilt and the haunting by his wife. The attraction nears its end with a shocking surprise, literally, as for some reason the handrails going down the stairs would have been electrically charged. The final show scene would have featured the wife trapped in a chest, surrounded by other victims of the dreaded pirate who decided to hang around. Get out of here, 2003 Haunted Mansion, you're not part of this episode. This initial version of the haunted house attraction would serve only as a foundation, and would drastically change and expand over the course of 1957. The walkthrough would become heavily inspired by the Winchester Mystery Mansion tours, both in terms of operation and its backstory involving a literal haunted mansion built to house spirits. The exterior would also see changes, and was eventually designed to resemble the Hipley Ladecker house in Baltimore. Before the end of the year, a far more elaborate and finalized version of the haunted house, also known as the Ghost House, was ready to be brought to life. So let's take a tour of the haunted mansion that could have been. The experience began at the attraction's ticket booth, which doubled as a guest registry for reasons we'll get to later, and visitors approached the haunted house. Just like the previous version, a hairy-armed man grabbed a woman in the window, but this time it would play a much larger role in the attraction itself. Groups of 40 people would gather at the front porch, and Walt Disney's voice would provide the introduction to the house's backstory.
in the magic mirror. Come from the farthest space.
The house was built in the 18th century and belonged to the Blood family and was also known as the Bloodmere House. Many years later, it was moved to Disneyland to be restored to its former glory, but every time workers made repairs and additions to the house during the day, at night they were destroyed and workers had to start over. After the mysterious disappearance of a Disneyland carpenter inside the house, the restoration process was completely abandoned. However, by way of a trained butler, aka tour guide, the house exists as an experience for you, the guest. You enter the house and find yourself in a dark, empty hall, where suddenly the door into the room shuts by itself, and a shadowy figure appears above, shaking a large chandelier before disappearing with a maniacal laugh. Thankfully, the butler appears just in time to quell many nerves, warning visitors to keep away from the walls. Just then, the hairy-armed man from earlier, simply known as Harry the Arm, nearly kidnaps the butler. After recovering, the tour officially begins through the portrait gallery, where the attraction's music also begins and continues through the walkthrough. As you walk through the gallery, the butler talks about the spirits that dwell in the house, where the eyes of the paintings would follow visitors. Once you enter the library, it's here where the butler expands on the tragedy that befell the house, just as a storm begins, as seen through a window. It seems the Captain Gore story survived until nearly the final revisions, as some concept art shows this as the family portrait. However, eventually the backstory became far less sinister, in which the daughter of the Blood family was to be married with a grand ceremony, but an event too terrible to mention, according to the butler, kills the family and all of the guests. So every 150 years, the spirits attempt to complete the ceremony that will lift and erase the curse on the house.
But Dad, we have to help them break the curse!
Why is everybody talking about a curse?
Okay, movie, you get 1 point for using one idea from the original version, but that's it. At this point, you were introduced to the Lonesome Ghost, a spirit who prefers the company of humans and would have been voiced by Peter Lorre. He explains a bit more of the house's backstory before realizing he's invisible and no one can see him. By way of an illusion, he appears above the fireplace, stunning visitors by addressing a few of them by their names, made possible by the guest registry/ticket booth mentioned earlier. Here the butler was again nearly kidnapped by Harry the Arm, though in some versions he was kidnapped and the Lonesome Ghost took over as your guide. While we're on the subject, if the Lonesome Ghost sounds familiar, it was actually a set of characters in the 1937 animated short film The Lonesome Ghosts. However, whether it was simply inspiration or to be a direct tie-in is unknown. Anyway, the Lonesome Ghost vanishes through a wall into the next room, and as you hear him on the other side, opens a secret panel for visitors. You then enter the gallery, but the Lonesome Ghost is interrupted by the sound of blood-curdling screams, where the ghost of the bride is being chased on the balcony above. The screams continue, and she appears on top of the stairway, where she trips and quite literally loses her head, with the Lonesome Ghost telling visitors she'll have to pull herself together for the wedding. A more detailed version of the original layout shows another instance of the reoccurring gag where Harry the Arm nearly kidnaps the tour guide. Through another secret passageway, the tour continued behind the walls of the house and was filled with bats and spiders. You then found yourself looking into a bedroom where the storm outside becomes even more fierce as seen through another window. Suddenly, with a clash of lightning, a ghost appears in a rocking chair and another is revealed in the bed with floating objects. Then a door suddenly opens to reveal the spirit of Uncle Orville taking a bath.
No clarity at all around this place.
The more detailed version of the layout reveals the bedroom's finale, in which the butler is finally kidnapped by Harry the Arm. The lights go out and we hear a scuffle behind the walls, then silence. The doors into the next room open, and we find a very disheveled but still alive butler, reassuring visitors of the tour's safety. You're now inside the Grand Salon, where a large broken window looks out into an abandoned family graveyard. A wolf howls and lightning flashes, and ghostly skeletons rise from their graves, one after another after another. They float over the graveyard and appear to enter the room above you, as these are the guests arriving for the wedding. With the sound of horse hooves in the distance, a mysterious figure travels across the graveyard, and you eventually come face to face with the Headless Horseman as he travels by the window. As you prepare to leave the room, the butler opens a pair of doors, and there was either a final appearance of Harry the Arm, or the body of the lost Disneyland carpenter fell out and onto the floor. Either way, you instead exit out of the room through a moving fireplace. In the next room, the storm picks up again, and with another flash of lightning, the ceiling becomes transparent, revealing the body of a man hanging from a noose. Or as the Lonesome Ghost says, "Ugh, the best man seems to be all tied up." You also now realize you're standing above a giant pit with an equally giant octopus, holding onto the remains of his latest victim. This leads to a mirrored hallway with spirits on their way to the wedding, and opens into a party room filled to the brim with iconic monsters and ghosts, in other words, a licensing rights nightmare. Finally, we're led into the Great Hall, where the wedding is about to begin.
This was to have been her wedding dress.
Okay, 2 points. You get 2 points for tying into the original narrative. The organist begins to play a ghostly rendition of the wedding march, and it seems the wedding guests would have materialized right before the eyes of visitors. This scene went through a few alterations, one of which involving a gag with a headless bride, and another where the bride leaves the groom at the altar. Either way, the storm outside reaches its peak, and the ceiling would appear to collapse, revealing the tragedy that befell the house and the wedding ceremony. Unfortunately, this also meant the spirits would have to repeat the event in another 150 years, or risk being doomed for all of eternity.
When they died, they couldn't find the light, and now they're trapped.
Doomed to wander the earth for all eternity.
Okay, 3 points. You get 3 points, but that's it. The tour finishes through a trophy room and another secret passageway, and officially ends with visitors exiting outside into the Blood family crypt, graveyard, and garden. This was in and of itself a standalone experience, with plenty of secrets to learn even more about the haunted house's backstory. However, before you leave, you were given the option of purchasing some delicious wedding cake, a lonesome ghost lapel button, or balloon as a souvenir. Oh come on, that wasn't even a joke.
Hi, welcome to Disney Studios. We've been expecting you. Walt said to tell you he'd meet you on stage 4.
By October of 1957, a mock-up of the ghost house was built at the Disney Studios. Apparently, they even had test audiences experience the walkthrough, both for timing purposes and testing the illusions. Unfortunately, the ghost house was facing several difficulties, most of them stemming from the walkthrough itself. As can be seen in the more detailed version of the layout, the paths of the visitors and tour guides was very specific to the attraction's operational efficiency, so the timing of the show scenes and guest flow was incredibly important and directly affected the total guests per hour. However, most of the illusions were taking much longer to stage properly between groups, a far cry from the initial estimation of 30 seconds. This resulted in a pretty abysmal hourly load capacity for an e-ticket attraction, and would have been the lowest at the park. This was partially solved with a rudimentary vehicle system, but this would have also required virtually all of the scenes to be completely reimagined. There was also the issue of some of the effects being hit or miss or unreliable, as according to Imagineers, some were nothing short of spectacular, but others fell short. So ultimately, Walt Disney put the haunted house, or ghost house, on hold, and Ken Anderson moved off the project to the Sleeping Beauty walkthrough. However, a couple years later, it was revived with a new set of Imagineers, a new proposed location, and a new name, the Haunted Mansion. It was advertised for a 1963 grand opening, but while the exterior was constructed on time, the attraction was nowhere to be seen, with only signs hinting at the future ride.
This is what we call our Imagineering department. It's where we dream up our new projects for Disneyland or World's Fair.
The culprit was primarily the 1964 through 65 New York World's Fair, as virtually every Imagineer was assigned to attractions for the event. By the time the fair was over, between innovations such as human-like audio animatronics and a new vehicle system, work resumed on the Haunted Mansion. However, Imagineers essentially began from scratch, and virtually all of the original Ghost House plans and ideas were abandoned.
Mark Davis is the master in charge of our House of Illusions, or what do we call it?
A Haunted Mansion.
Now, I've already extensively covered the evolution of the Haunted Mansion and its abandoned effects in a previous episode, but one thing I didn't cover is what made it from the original Ken Anderson version into the one that actually became a reality. No, I said what made it into the attraction, not the movie. Okay. I'll admit it, for as much as I dislike the 2003 adaptation, it does pay quite a few homages to the original Unbuilt version.
I was hoping this would be a happy ending.
First was the enclosed walk-through graveyard after exiting the ghost house. Initially this was to be a standalone experience and was actually built with the mansion, and was left intact, although empty, for quite some time. However, eventually foreseeing the need for a longer queue, the walls were demolished and most of the section became a walkway with a small graveyard, but was eventually removed entirely for even more queue space. Imagineers also paid homage to Ken Anderson's window gag, only instead featuring a ghostly light traveling across the mansion's window. Interestingly, the abandoned Captain Gore narrative was revived and wound up in the attraction, although incredibly subtle. The bride in the attic represented the fiancé who stumbled upon the captain's dark past. When vehicles travel out of the attic into the graveyard, this was the guest taking on the role of the bride being tossed out of the window to her death. The frightened caretaker and poor doggo are shaking in fear of seeing you, the bride, having become a ghost. The spirits in the graveyard may have also been inspired by the wedding guests and musicians. The corpse hanging in the portrait stretching room is probably the most direct element taken from the ghost house. A close second is the ballroom scene, as while originally it was a wedding ceremony, many visuals carried over, plus the ghost in the rocking chair. There's also a reference to Harry the Arm as a shadow over the clock before the seance room. Finally, over at the Magic Kingdom, its version of the Haunted Mansion would feature the portrait hallway as initially envisioned, where the eyes follow guests passing by. That is until it was removed in 2007. So at the end of the day, we may not have gotten the haunted house as once imagined, but enough influences were kept and remain today that pay respect to what could have been.